Today we're going to talk about more lost letters. This is something I covered in a previous video where we talked about several of the letters that once existed in the English alphabet but have since disappeared or been relegated to a different function entirely. And today, by popular demand, we're going to be talking about two letters that are quite well remembered as lost letters of English, and these are called Eth and Thorn. Eth and Thorn. It could be some kind of high brand boutique for selling luxury handbags on a London high street. But no, they are actually two letters that we see here. The Eth looks a bit like a D with a line through it. That's essentially what it is. And Thorn is often confused with a P, but the stave goes on longer. The stave, by the way, this is an important term for this video. It's basically the straight bit, the back of a letter, like a B or a D or a P, is called a stave. So let's focus in on the letter Thorn first. Now, Thorn, before it was a letter in the Latin alphabet, was a rune, and the oldest writing system of runes is collectively known by runologists as the Elder Futhark, named after the first characters in this writing system. And the thorn is the th part of Futhark. Now, in the Elder Futhark, this rune was equated with the sound th. Now, this sound th, we're going to come across it in today's video, is called a voiceless dental fricative. Sounds a bit scary and linguistic. All it means is that you produce the sound by putting your tongue against your teeth. So that's like a duh, for example, but also a th. The fact that it's a fricative means that air can blow through at the same time, and so we end up with a th sound. Now, the reconstructed name of this rune, as the runes are given names as well, is Thurisaz, and this means something like ogre or giant, it's often translated as. And it's believed that it only represented this voiceless fricative sound, this th. Most runologists agree that the form of the rune is derived from the Latin letter of a D. Now, especially when it's carved in Roman carvings, you might see it very similar to a thorn, but this makes a lot of sense, especially because as a dental, although it doesn't sound particularly like a duh, it is actually pretty close to this sound. A duh, if you blow the air through instead of having it as a stop, becomes a th. So the thinking is that this is simply a Latin D but attached to a stave and made with straight lines, which is essentially what runes are a lot of the time. Many other runes are also derived from Latin letters, so that's where we get the thorn. Now, in the younger Futhark, which is the development of the runic writing system in Scandinavia, so for example, throughout the Viking Age, people were carving younger Futhark runes if they were from a Scandinavian background. This name that we find attached to the rune is Thurs, and this name is basically the descendant of this reconstructed word Thurisaz that we saw in the Elder Futhark. And it's known from the younger Futhark in that language, the Proto-Norse language, the Old Norse language as it would become, that this could represent both a voiceless fricative, so a th, as well as a voiced fricative. Now, the voiced dental fricative is the in the word the. So, for example, you have cloth, voiceless, these, voiced. Cloth. So, for example, you have cloth, voiceless, and clothe is voiced. Th and the. That's the distinction that's being brought up here, and both of these sounds are represented by the same runic character, the Thurs. Now, if we go over and we look at the Anglo-Frisian Futhark, so this is the way that the Futhark developed in England and over in Frisia, we find the same character again, but with a different name. Here it's known as Thorn, at least among the Anglo-Saxons, the Old English speakers. We don't actually know what the Frisians called it because we don't have any evidence for their rune names, we just have their runes. And again, this was the runic symbol that was capable of displaying. This was the rune that was used for both a voiceless and a voiced sound. Now, we have several pieces of evidence about where this runic letter was used and what the names were from rune poems. Now, the Anglo-Saxon rune poem is by far the oldest, and in it we read the explanation of the word. So here we have the first word is Thorn, which is the name. Thorn bethel shearb, theina jehulchum, anfängis üvel, onjemetum rede mana jehulchum, thehim midrested. And this translates to thorn, so the name of the rune, is painfully sharp to any warrior. Seizing it is bad, excessively severe for any person who lays among them. And these are kind of like riddles, as in that the description describes the name of the rune. And instead of writing thorn, they actually put the rune thorn in the manuscript. So the answer is thorn. Interestingly, we also have rune poems from the Old Norse world. So the one that we have is the Icelandic rune poem. This, I believe, is penned sometime in the 15th century, and this one is slightly different. It says, Thursar kvenna kvull, og klettabui, og varðrurar fer, Saturnus þengill. And this means giant. Again, we just have the rune, but as I mentioned, the Younger Futhorc, it's called Thurs, torture of women, and cliff dweller, and husband of a giantess, Saturn's thane. Now, a few scholars have been, raised their eyebrows about why Saturn is being mentioned. Possibly this is a reference to Ymir, who is the cosmic being in Norse mythology, the first giant, the ancestor of the giants, who is killed and from which the universe is created. And obviously at the time when they're writing this isn't pagan Viking stuff, even though we associate that with runes. This is being written in the Middle Ages, so when people were reading lots of Roman things and using Roman names for various Norse gods as well. There's also a Norwegian rune poem, which I believe has been dated to slightly earlier than the Icelandic rune poem, but the only existing copy we have is from a little bit later. And the Norwegian rune poem says, Thurs feilder kvinnar kvitlu, Kautar veirðar fár of itlu, which translates to giant causes anguish to women, misfortune makes few men cheerful. So these are our attestations for the names of the runes, and based on these runes, the names they've reconstructed the Elder Futhorc name. Something interesting though is, why is there a different name for the rune in the Younger Futhorc and in the Anglo-Frisian Futhorc? Because most of the other runes, they are just the Old Norse and the Old English words for the same thing. Clearly there has been a difference here. Well, part of it is that the Old Norse giant, that word Thurs, is quite mythological. It's related to these beings. The giants, or Jotnar, another word for giants, often appear in stories with the Old Norse gods. So one theory that I heard at university, at least, was because the Anglo-Saxons had converted to Christianity quite early on, it was no longer fitting for them to have a rune name that was kind of mythological and slightly connected to pagan stories, and that's why they changed it to Thorn. An alternative that I've heard is basically that Thorn is kind of like a giant, like a thorn in your side kind of way, but I'm not entirely sold on that. Obviously, the Vikings were famous for not being Christian for longer than the Anglo-Saxons. But really, that doesn't make too much sense in this case, why they kept Thurs, because when Old Norse was being written down in manuscripts, like the rune poems, they were absolutely Christian and they were being written by Christians. But a slight difference there is that a lot of the impetus for the earliest writing we have on Iceland is because of poetry, and a lot of the poetry was composed in earlier times, in pagan times, and that's why they wrote so much about these gods, unlike in England, where we really don't know a lot about pagan gods. So that might be one reason why the rune name in the rune poem, well, it had been solidified at that point, and they were writing about mythology anyway, so they kept that name around for much longer. So the Thorn letter, as well as being a rune, it became a letter and was written in manuscripts, like in the Old English Beowulf, which we can see the starting line of here. You can see that Thorn appears all over the shot in this edition. Let's move on to look at Eth. And Eth essentially wasn't a rune to begin with. Eth is actually just based on the Latin alphabet. What's interesting is that the Anglo-Saxons, when they wanted to write their language with Latin letters, soon realized that the Latin alphabet is based on Latin, as simple as it sounds, and so it's not really meant to represent the sounds of the Germanic languages, which had some different sounds that Latin didn't have. And this th sound is one of those sounds that Latin simply didn't have. So there were several strategies for writing this down, and the eth is basically one of these strategies. It's recognizing that the sound is close to a d, which did exist in Latin, but then spicing it up slightly. So you add a line to show that it's different to a normal d, but a the instead, or a th. And that's where we get the eth from. What is interesting is that eth and thorn had a developing relationship with one another in the way that they were used by the Anglo-Saxons. So if we look around the year 1000 at quite late Old English being produced in Wessex in the south, we can see quite a consistent pattern, where at the start of words they would use a thorn, and in the middle of words and at the end of words they would use an eth. Now, you often see, especially online, people saying that, oh yeah, the thorn is for the voiceless fricative, so the th sound, whereas the eth is for the voice fricative, the sound. But there is no basis for this when you look at Old English. And we actually see different patterns in different areas at different times. So if we look, for instance, at earlier Old English in charters from 700 from the Kingdom of Kent, we can see slightly different usage, where while in the later Old English they are using thorns and eths all over the place, in earlier Old English they're actually using the th, which is another method of producing this sound when writing in Latin, and simply a d for the eth instead. So actually very similar to what would happen in later English. But then it gets even more confusing, because while that system is using the digraph of th to represent the thorn, they are in the same place. So at the start of words they're using th, and in the middle of words or at the end of words they're using a d, whereas later that would be an eth. However, if we look at Mercian Old English charters from a similar period in time, they actually flip this completely on its head, and they use d or t at the start, and they use just the th in the middle of words and at the end of words. So it's a whole mixed bag. This is actually quite interesting, because it seems that the usage of the way that they were using different styles in Kent and then introducing the eth and the thorn actually influenced the way that they used it in Mercia. The Kentish data may be consistent with an S-curve, gradual initial adoption followed by a fast increase evident in the Mercian charters with Kentish beneficiaries from the 780s on. The Mercian data, on the other hand, suggest no initial period of gradual adoption. In Mercia, however, we appear to be dealing with a change that happens very quickly, and without an initial period of gradual adoption. This sort of sudden and thoroughgoing orthographic change is unlikely to arise organically. A more plausible explanation is that Mercian practice sometime in the 770s or 780s was reformed following practice elsewhere. This is from an article called Adapting the Roman Alphabet for Writing in Old English by Philip Shaw, where he compared looking at these early charters from both Kent and Mercia together with evidence from early Anglo-Saxon coins with inscriptions to work out how eth and thorn were adopted and what other strategies were used for writing Old English with the Latin alphabet. And interestingly, while Mercia adopted the Kentish way of writing eth and thorn and in which positions, this was actually at a period when Mercia was the dominant military power in England. The king of Mercia, King Offa, famous for building Offa's Dyke, was the most powerful king in the country, called the Bretwalda, and they exercised a lot of power over Kent. So normally we say that the victors write the histories, but in this case it seems that they wrote the history using the standards from Kent. So this is quite an interesting little dichotomy here. As I mentioned, another way of looking at the adoption of eth and thorn is to look at writing on coins, inscriptions, which seem to have had slightly different styles than in the manuscripts, although eventually both coalesced and started using Eth and Thorn in the same positions, both on coins and in manuscripts and charters. For sure, this suggests that probably we're looking at quite a small writing population, so a small segment of the population that knew how to write and that would sort of share their way of doing things. Otherwise, you'd expect completely random ways of writing Eth and Thorn and D and T and TH, but actually we see that they follow on quite soon from one another. So that's another interesting point. Now, things would get more tricky for Eth and Thorn following the Norman Conquest, which we discussed in the previous video. Thorn would continue to be written, although Eth would kind of fall by the wayside. But Thorn would have a harder time when the printing press came along. And the reason why is that both Eth and Thorn, following the Norman Conquest, and actually as we already saw now in these early charters, already in the Anglo-Saxon period, was sometimes being spelled with TH. A fun aside is that when Old Frisian is written down, the earliest extant manuscripts we have are from around 1300, but actually the oldest written Frisian we have is from 1100 as a gloss. They never use Thorn or Eth at all. We only ever see TH being used to represent the sound. So by that time, it's completely gone. And that TH seems to have become the dominant form by around 1300. A real problem for remaining users of Thorn, and by this point Thorn was being used only in a couple of sort of set phrases rather than for new words with a TH. That would come around 1440 with the movable printing press. And the reason why is because then obviously you had various characters that you could use for printing, so you would order in these characters, and then you had the same thing with the long S. Then you wonder, well, do we need to order a separate character, or can we just use a T and a H? So that sort of did in for Thorn. An interesting thing, though, is that, of course, the word for the would traditionally be written with a thorn and then E. But as time went on, and with the onset of printing, some people still wanted to represent the in this way with a thorn, but they started to write it more like a Y, and then with printing they just used a Y. And that ultimately is why you get phrases like ye olde. It's not actually ye olde, it's just the old, but written in an old way, using this adapted thorn instead of the actual thorn. So that's a cool bit of history here. This is a 16th century manuscript, and here we can actually see some of this in process. The quality isn't the highest on the image here, but that is a Y, and then above it we have an E. And this is one of several Thorn shorthands that were used at the time. So this is you instead of seeing a Y, see it as a thorn, and then above it you have an E. And this was a shorthand for the, because it would be Thorn E, so the makes sense. Here is another one where we can see a Y, but again, read that as a thorn with a T above it. And this would be the word for that, because, well, the and T, so that. There also existed another type of these, which is a thorn and a U, thu, and obviously later on thou. That form would be represented like this. Interestingly, in Old English there was already one version of a shortening which we can see, which is a thorn with a crossbar added, a cross thorn, and this would be that, which is one of the words in Old English for the, as well as obviously for modern English, that. So that's pretty cool. Now, are there any modern languages that still use Eth and Thorn? There are. Obviously, the most famous one of these is Icelandic. Icelandic continues to use both Eth and Thorn, although for slightly different sounds. Eth can be used both for the voiced and the unvoiced, although I believe these are closer to sibilants rather than to fricatives. And also it uses a thorn in the way of the unvoiced. And again, I think that's a sibilant with the line underneath and a fricative, but someone who's better with IPA can mention that. Interestingly, the orthography of Faroese also has plenty of Eths and Thorns. So I was very excited when I visited the Faroe Islands with my 1 year of Old Norse. I thought, oh, great, I'll be able to try out and speak some Old Norse with them. And they had no idea what I was saying, because in actual fact, the sounds of Eth and Thorn don't exist in Faroese anymore. They are long gone. The only reason they have it when written down is because they used Icelandic orthography for writing down Faroese. But both of these sounds are zeros, so basically you just don't pronounce that bit. It's like a kind of schwa. You just skip over it in a Faroese word. So yeah, you don't pronounce them at all. Interestingly, there is another North Germanic language that still uses just the Eth, and this is the Elfdalian language. It's a minority language spoken by around 1,000 people, I believe, in the Elfdal area in Sweden, and there it is still used as just the voiced dental fricative there. And interestingly enough, several dialects of North Frisian also have this voiceless, this voiced dental fricative, this the sound in the language, in words like fother for father in the Söring dialect, for example. I looked into this a little bit because having spoken with some North Frisians, I can't recall hearing this sound, and I'm not sure if this is actual. North Frisians in the comments, let me know if this sound is still actively being used as the rather than anything else, but I believe it is still presently used in several different dialects, island dialects of North Frisian. So there we go. This was the story of Eth and Thorn and several more missing letters in the English alphabet. Thank you very much for watching, everyone. I've been Hilbert, and this was The History.